I'm Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute. The last video from the Center for Freedom and Prosperity looked at the successes of the Reagan and Clinton administrations and demonstrated that it is possible to restrain the growth of federal spending. In this follow-up video, we're going to travel around the world to examine how other nations also got great results by engaging in multi-year periods of fiscal restraint. Let's start with Canada. As you can see on your screen, our neighbors to the north were in deep fiscal trouble. But then, beginning nearly 20 years ago, the politicians decided to do the right thing. And for 5 years, government was put on a diet. Between 1992 and 1997, Canada's budget rose from $374 billion to only $391 billion, an average annual increase of less than 1%. That was great news for Canada's fiscal position, regardless of what variable you care about. We explained in another video that controlling spending was the most important goal, and the burden of spending in Canada dropped from 53.3% of GDP all the way down to 44.3% of GDP. But if you happen to think that reducing deficits should be the top priority, it turns out that spending restraint is the right approach. Canada's fiscal balance went from a deficit of 9.1% of GDP to a surplus of 0.2% of GDP during this period. This is not to say that Canada or any of the other nations we're going to discuss is a role model. Government is still far too large. But remember, we're showing that nations can move in the right direction if they simply control spending so that it grows slower than tax revenue. Now let's shift to Ireland. The Emerald Isle was in a tailspin in the 1980s. The burden of government had skyrocketed and the nation's debt was enormous. Irish policymakers realized that they needed to restrain the burden of government spending. And for a period of time, there was genuine fiscal restraint. The Irish budget was €14.7 billion in 1985, and in 1989, it was only €14.7 billion. The results were spectacular. The burden of government spending, which had climbed to more than 60% of GDP, plummeted all the way down to less than 43% of economic output. And for those of you who focus on deficits, you'll be happy to know that Ireland's 4-year spending freeze reduced the budget deficit from 12.1% of GDP all the way down to 2.7% of GDP in just 4 years. Irish politicians implemented other pro-growth policies in subsequent years, such as the 12.5% corporate tax rate. That helped boost growth, so the country seemed to be on the right path. Sadly, Ireland didn't handle prosperity well. A housing bubble and big spending increases have erased most of the gains, and I'm rather pessimistic about the future. So let's cheer up with a better example. Slovakia, like many other nations that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Empire, was saddled with a bloated public sector. As with our other examples, you can see a period of meaningful spending restraint starting about a decade ago. From 2000 to 2003, the Slovakian budget grew from €11.5 billion to €11.8 billion. That's an increase, but only 1.3% each year on average. And because of this fiscal restraint, the burden of government spending fell from nearly 37% of economic output down to 29.2% of GDP. The deficit, meanwhile, dropped from 8.7% of GDP to 2% of GDP. Fiscal discipline has paid big dividends for Slovakia, particularly since the nation's leaders also implemented pro-growth policies such as the flat tax and personal retirement accounts, and these help boost economic growth. It's not quite Hong Kong, but Slovakia is definitely a nation moving in the right direction. Last but not least, let's look at New Zealand. The burden of the public sector by the 1980s had climbed to more than 1/2 of economic output. Like all our examples, the Kiwis staged a turnaround by engaging in a period of fiscal discipline. Between 1990 and 1995, the New Zealand budget actually dropped from $39.3 billion to $38.8 billion. Let's pause for a moment and think about what New Zealand's leaders accomplished. They actually shrank the size of the state, not just relative to GDP, which is our normal measure of success, they actually reduced nominal spending, a truly remarkable achievement. There were other pro-growth policies that boosted economic performance, and the combination of fiscal restraint and economic growth led to a big drop in the relative burden of government spending, from 53.5% of economic output in 1990 all the way down to 43.1% of GDP in 1995. Not surprisingly, limiting government spending that New Zealand over that period went from a deficit of 4.5% of GDP to a surplus of 2.8% of GDP. Let's conclude by noting that the budget deficit in America, or just about any other nation, quickly would disappear with a similar level of fiscal responsibility. Controlling the growth of government spending, or better yet, reducing spending, is the definition of good fiscal policy. And if you focus on the real problem of excessive government, you'll also address the symptom of too much government borrowing. But will that happen? America is at a crossroads. I'm hoping you can share this Center for Freedom and Prosperity video widely. Politicians will only do the right thing if all of us are educated and activated.